By day 30 of the outbreak, I'd stopped counting sunsets. Not because I gave up, but because the sky didn't look the same anymore. It hadn't since week 2, when the smoke from the cities started mixing with the clouds and everything took on this bruised, yellowish color that made the whole world feel like it was healing from something it hadn't told us about yet. I was moving south along the Washington coast, or what used to be the Washington coast before the roads turned into obstacle courses of abandoned vehicles and collapsed overpasses. My boots were soaked through, had been since 2 days back when I crossed a drainage creek that came up higher than expected. Cold had settled into my ankles like it lived there now, like it had unpacked its things and decided to stay. The plan was simple: find a small town, find food, keep moving south. The plan had stopped working around day 11. So by 30 I wasn't following a plan anymore. I was following the coastline because the coastline didn't have infected pooled up in clusters the way the inland roads did, salt air and open ground. That was the logic. Stay where the wind moves, stay where you can see what's coming. Except that morning, I couldn't see much of anything. Fog had rolled in off the Pacific sometime before dawn and it hadn't burned off the way it normally did. It just sat there, thick and low and uncommonly quiet for a stretch of coast that I'd expected to hear waves on. The water was out there somewhere. I could smell it, that cold, dead fish and brine smell that coastal fog drags in like a curtain. But visibility was maybe 30 feet in any direction and everything beyond that was just gray. I was moving slow on a gravel road that hugged the bluff line when I noticed the guardrail bent outward. Not from a crash. I'd seen crash damage enough by now to know the difference. This was bent away from the roadside. Something had pushed through it from the inland edge. Something heavy that came out of the tree line and went over the bluff. I crouched and looked over the edge. 40 feet down, maybe 50, a rocky inlet. And sitting in that inlet, half beached on the rocks and half floating in the dark water, was a ship. Not a small one. I don't know exactly what I expected to find in a place like this, another abandoned cabin maybe, a collapsed fish processing shed, not a vessel this size. It must have been 250 feet long at least. Maybe more, gray-hulled, with a flat working deck and a superstructure amidships that rose maybe 5 stories above the waterline. The kind of ship that doesn't belong anywhere near a place like this. A vessel like this belongs in a harbor, in a dry dock, tied up to some government pier with security cameras and restricted access signs every 10 feet. Not here. Not run aground in a rocky inlet on the Washington coast with its lights still on. But the lights were on. I could see them even through the fog, a faint amber glow from the portholes along the midship section, and a flicker from somewhere on the upper deck that pulsed, like electrical equipment browning out and coming back. I stood at the guardrail for a long time. Long enough that my fingers went numb against the cold metal. The rational part of my brain said keep moving. Ships that run aground in isolated inlets with their lights still on 30 days into a global outbreak are not the kind of thing you investigate alone with a half-empty pack and 62 rounds to your name. Rational brain had a point. But rational brain also hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days. And rational brain knew my water filter had started letting sediment through 2 days ago and I wasn't far from drinking whatever came out of a ditch. A ship this size, if it was a research vessel, if it was what I was starting to think it was, it would have supplies. It would have freshwater tanks, medical stores, communication equipment. I looked at the lights again. Amber, steady, not emergency lighting, not flickering backup power, operational lights. Something on that ship was still running. Something with enough juice to keep interior lighting alive 30 days into collapse, out here in the middle of nowhere. Whoever anchored this ship here did not do it by accident. I started looking for a way down. The bluff face was loose shale and root-tangled soil, not the kind of thing you climb down casually. I moved along the guardrail line until the bluff flattened into a rocky slope maybe a quarter-mile north. Came down slow, testing every foothold. The fog muffled sound so completely that my own breathing sounded too loud and everything else sounded like nothing at all. I hit the beach and the gravel crunched under my boots in a way that made me wince. The inlet was calmer than it had any right to be. The water barely moved. It just sat there, flat and dark and oily looking in the fog, like something had taken the motion out of it. The ship was about 80 feet from the gravel shore, its bow buried in a jumble of rocks and its stern sitting low and heavy in the black water. I could see a name on the hull now, but the letters were partially obscured by rust streaks and what looked like dried bioluminescent residue. The kind that crusts up on vessel hulls when they've been sitting in certain types of algae-heavy water for a long time. I could make out enough to read. RV Crestmore. The RV prefix meant research vessel. I'd expected it, but seeing it confirmed something that made the back of my neck go cold. This wasn't a Coast Guard cutter. Wasn't a commercial ship that wandered off course. This was purpose-built for scientific operations, and it had ended up here. Run aground in a remote inlet in the fog with its lights still on and its name half buried in rust like it had been here longer than 30 days. Much longer. I circled the bow section where the hull had crumpled against the rocks and found what I was looking for on the port side. An accommodation ladder, one of those fold-down metal staircases that research vessels keep rigged for boarding in anchorages. It was partially deployed, hanging at about a 45-degree angle with its lower platform dunked in about 2 feet of water. The rungs were slick with condensation and something greenish I didn't want to think about too hard. I waded into the base of it. Cold hit my legs like a physical thing. Grabbed the lowest rung and pulled. Solid. I climbed. The main deck felt different under my boots than I expected. There was a give to it. Not structural. More like the decking itself had absorbed moisture for long enough that it had started to soften beneath the surface coat of anti-slip paint. The fog was thinner up here, elevated above the surface of the water. I could see the full length of the working deck now, and what I saw didn't add up. Equipment was still rigged. Not stowed, not secured for heavy weather, just in place, as if the people who used it had stepped away expectant to come back. A pair of large winches on the stern deck had cable wound out and trailing over the fantail into the water below. What was attached to the other end of that cable I couldn't tell, and I wasn't in a hurry to find out. Sampling equipment stood in rows along the midship railing. Sealed containers and collection apparatus that looked expensive and specialized. The kind of gear that doesn't leave behind for nothing. There was no sign of damage up here. No struggle, no debris scatter, nothing knocked over or broken. Whatever happened on the ship didn't happen on deck. The hatch to the superstructure was unlocked. Not just unlocked, it was held open by a rubber doorstop wedged deliberately under the frame, like someone had propped it open and meant to come back through it soon. I pulled the doorstop free and let the hatch swing. It moved on hinges that weren't corroded, didn't protest, didn't scream the way neglected shipboard hardware does, maintained, regularly maintained. Inside the superstructure the air changed immediately. Warm, noticeably warm, and carrying a smell that I couldn't place for a moment. Antiseptic underneath. But something else on top of it. Biological, but not the rot smell I'd been living with for 30 days. More like a terrarium, or an aquarium with its filter running, organic and close and controlled. The corridor was lit by fluorescent strips overhead, 2 of them flickering in the way fluorescents do when ballasts start to fail. But most of them holding steady, painting everything in that flat institutional light that makes color look wrong. The walls were white painted steel, and they were clean. I ran my finger along the edge of a conduit bracket. No dust. Not the absence of dust you get when things are too wet for it to settle. Actual clean. Wiped clean. Recently. I moved down the corridor toward the galley first because that was the priority. For days without real food makes priorities simple. The galley was midship, port side, a compact space with a stainless steel preparation counter and a row of overhead storage lockers and a heavy gauge range that was cold but sat above a heating element that still had power connected to it. Someone could have turned it on and had it working in minutes. I went through the storage lockers. Canned goods, vacuum-sealed dry stores, freeze-dried protein pouches, enough food to keep a crew of 12 going for months. I stood there in front of it for a moment. Just stared. I hadn't seen this much food in one place since before day one. I ate slowly and deliberately because I knew better by now than to wreck my stomach after extended deprivation. Crackers and peanut butter and half a can of chickpeas that I didn't even bother to heat. I ate standing up because something about sitting down in this galley felt wrong. The table at the center of the space had 4 chairs arranged around it, and 3 of those chairs still had coffee mugs on the table in front of them. Not pushed aside. Placed. Intentionally placed like whoever was sitting there meant to come back and finish. I picked up the nearest mug and turned it in my hands. A thin skin of dried residue in the bottom. Coffee days old. Not weeks, not months, days. I set it down carefully. And that's when I heard the sound. Not from the corridor. Not from above. From below. A low, rhythmic sound that you feel before you properly hear it, like the heartbeat of the ship itself. Except ships don't beat like that. They hum, they vibrate, they creak. They don't produce something that sounds almost like respiration. Slow, heavy, regular. In and out, In. I stood very still in the galley and listened. 30 seconds. A minute. It didn't stop. Whatever was producing that sound somewhere in the decks below me wasn't machinery. I knew what machinery sounded like. I'd spent time on my cousin's fishing boat as a kid, and I knew the sound of diesel engines and bilge pumps and ventilation systems and refrigeration compressors. This wasn't any of those things. This was organic. And it was consistent. And it was comin' from directly below where I was standin'. I backed out of the galley and stood in the corridor and tried to think clearly. The RV Crestmore was a research vessel, operational, moored in a concealed inlet with no crew visible on deck, fully stocked with supplies, warm interior, active power systems, and something below decks that was breathin'. I should have left. I know that now, and I think I knew it then too. Somewhere beneath the hunger and the exhaustion and the 4 days of rationalizing every questionable decision I'd made on this coastline, I knew that the correct answer was to take what I could carry from that galley and go back down that accommodation ladder and put as much distance between myself and this ship as the daylight hours would allow. Instead, I went looking for the stairs down. The ship had 3 decks below the main. I knew this because I found a laminated emergency evacuation diagram bolted to the corridor wall near the main stairwell access. The kind of thing that's required on all research vessels, color-coded, with muster stations and life raft embarkation points marked in green and fire suppression zones in red. The layout told me things. Main deck, crew quarters, galley, common areas. A deck below, science labs, instrument room, computer systems, wet lab. B deck, storage, mechanical spaces, engineering. C deck, at the very bottom of the diagram, at the very bottom of the ship, was a space labeled simply as containment and specimen hold. That word, containment. I'd heard it before in a different context, not 2 weeks before I found this ship, from a man I'd traveled with for 3 days before he got bit near a collapsed pharmacy outside of Centralia. He'd worked in state emergency management before everything fell apart, and he told me things I hadn't wanted to believe at the time. That the outbreak didn't originate the way the early broadcasts said it did, that there were facilities, programs, research initiatives that had been running long before day one that nobody in the public sector was supposed to know about. Containment. He'd used that word specifically. I stood in front of that evacuation diagram for a long time. A deck first. That was the rational choice. Science labs meant documentation, meant answers, meant some explanation for what the ship was doing here and what was making that sound below me. I took the stairs down. A deck was darker than the main. The fluorescents down here were further gone. 2 out of 5 strips active, and one of those flick errands so badly it created a strobing effect in the corridor that made my eyes hurt. The science labs were on the starboard side, a series of 3 rooms with heavy latching doors and small reinforced windows set into the frames. I looked through the first window. A standard analytical lab, bench-top equipment, centrifuges, fume hoods, the kind of setup you'd see in a university research facility. Except the surfaces weren't clean the way the galley corridor had been. Down here the benchtops were cluttered. Notebooks left open, samples and holders, equipment mid-process like someone walked away from an ongoing experiment and just never came back. The second room was bigger. What they call a wet lab, designed for working with living specimens. Seawater tanks lines one wall, large aquarium-style enclosures with circulation systems still running. I could hear the pumps from outside the door, and through the window I could see the tanks were occupied. Not by anything I recognized. The specimens in the tanks were small at that point. Palm-sized, maybe, translucent bodied with a dark central mass that pulsed irregularly with each of those slow breathin' sounds I'd been hearin' since the galley. They floated mid-water without movin' much. Just hung there in the circulated salt water with their dark centers pulsin'. I stared at them for a long time. They stared back. That's the part one have trouble explaining to anyone who wasn't there. The moment when I realized they were looking at me through the glass, not in the unfocused way that fish track movement near their tank, in the way that something looks at you when it's deciding what you are. I backed away from that window. Found the third lab. This one was different from the others, and I knew it before I even got the door fully open. The smell hit me first, that antiseptic over something biological smell from upstairs, but stronger here, concentrated, like the room was the source of it. Inside were not bench tops but workstations, computer terminals, monitors, a central analysis table with a light table built into its surface, and the walls. The walls were covered in documentation. Printed pages, handwritten notes, photographs, maps, all pinned in overlapping layers like someone had been working a very long problem for a very long time. I stepped closer and my flashlight moved across it and I started reading. Technical language mostly. Biological nomenclature I didn't fully understand. But the photographs were clear. The specimens in those tanks, they weren't always that small. The photographs were pinned in chronological order. I could tell because someone had written dates in the corner of each one in black marker. The earliest images showed the specimens the way I'd seen them in the tanks, small, translucent, passive, floating in controlled aquarium environments with measurement scales placed beside them for reference. But the dates moved forward and the specimens in the photographs did not stay small. By the third row of images they were the size of a dog, still translucent enough to see the dark pulsing core through the outer membrane, but the shape had changed. It had developed structure. Not the soft shapeless drift of the early specimens but actual physical architecture. Elongated limbs that were wrong in their proportions, too many joints, bend in directions that suggested a completely different relationship with gravity than anything I'd ever seen on land. By the fifth row they'd stopped fitting in the frame of a single photograph. Whoever was talking these pictures had to back up further and further to get the whole specimen in frame, and the expression on that. Even through a photograph printed on plain office paper and pinned to a steel wall, you could feel that the person behind the camera was backing up for reasons beyond just framing. I found the written documentation beneath the photographs. A project binder, thick, spiral-bound, its cover stamped with a classification marking I'd only ever seen on documents my cousin brought home from his time in naval intelligence before he got out. I opened it to the first page. Project Hadel. Phase 3 Behavioral Analysis. Crestmore Field Station. I turned pages. The early entries were clinical, measured, the language of researchers who believed entirely in what they were doing and had not yet had reason to question it. The project had begun, according to these notes, not as a response to the outbreak but years before it. The initial discovery was made in a deep-sea survey off the coast of the Aleutian Islands. Something pulled up in a sediment core sample from a depth of over 6,000 meters. Biological material that shouldn't have been viable at that depth under those pressure conditions. Material that was. And the word the original researcher used, the one that was circled in pencil by someone who came later and circled it with what felt like accusation, was persistent. The material was persistent. It survived conditions that should have killed it. And when it was brought to controlled environments and given warmth and circulation and appropriate nutrient medium, it didn't just survive. It responded. It adapted. It grew toward whatever stimulus the researchers introduced with a speed and directional intelligence that made them increasingly uncomfortable over the course of the first 6 months of observation. I kept reading. The project moved to the Crestmore approximately 18 months before the outbreak began. The ship was the perfect facility, mobile, isolated, able to relocate if necessary, with containment infrastructure built into its lower decks specifically for the transport and study of hazardous marine biological specimens. The team was small, 7 researchers, 2 vessel crew who were told only that the cargo was sensitive and classified, and a project director whose name appeared on every page, but whose signature at the bottom of each entry looked increasingly unsteady as the binder went on. Dr. Maren Voigt. Her early entries were confident, almost excited in the restrained way that serious scientists allow themselves to be excited in professional documentation. The discovery was significant, she wrote. Potentially the most significant biological find in recorded history. An organism of apparent non-terrestrial origin recovered from deepest ocean sediment that demonstrated not merely survival but active adaptation and apparent protocognition. Protocognition. I stopped on that phrase and read it again. Protocognition, meaning the earliest possible stage of awareness, meaning something that processes its environment not just through instinct but through something approaching thought. And this was the organism they had brought aboard the ship and placed in the tanks below. And the organism had been here when the outbreak started. And it was still here now. I turned to the final pages of the binder. Dr. Voigt's handwriting changed dramatically in the last dozen entries. The controlled precision of the earlier pages was gone. Letters ran into each other. Lines drifted off the horizontal. Entire sentences were scratched out and rewritten with corrections that were themselves sometimes scratched out. The content changed too. Less data, less clinical observation, more personal, more desperate in its reasoning. The entry dated 11 days before the outbreak read, "Behavioral escalation has exceeded all modeled parameters. The primary specimen has developed what we can only describe as strategic patience. It is no longer responding to stimuli the way earlier specimens did. It is not approaching the stimulus. It is waiting for the stimulus to approach it. Dr. Patel believes this is a new phase of cognitive development and recommends continued observation. I believe this is something else entirely. I have recommended immediate containment. Protocol escalation and relocation to a secure land facility, but headquarters has declined citing logistics. I am documenting this disagreement formally." The entry dated 4 days before the outbreak. "We have lost the secondary specimen. Not escaped, lost. The tank was intact. The circulation system was running. The specimen was simply no longer inside it when we conducted the 0600 check. We have searched the wet lab and the adjacent spaces and found no evidence of how it exited. I don't have an explanation. Dr. Reyes suggested a malfunction in the tank's upper seal, but the seal shows no damage. I am implementing a full ship search. Crew has been informed only that a containment sample has been misplaced." The final entry was dated 2 days before day 1. "We found Dr. Reyes." 3 words and then nothing. The pen had left a long trailing mark downward off the bottom of the page, as if her hand had moved, and the pen kept going after she stopped being in control of it. I closed the binder. Stood in that documentation room for a long moment with the photographs on the walls and the silence of the ship around me, and that slow rhythmic sound coming up through the floor from the deck below. In and out. In and out. I put the binder in my pack. And then I heard the footsteps. They were above me, on the main deck. I could hear them moving through the galley corridor, unhurried, not the stumbling lurching cadence of the infected, deliberate footfalls that stopped and started with the rhythm of someone who was searching a space carefully, someone who knew to check corners, someone who did practice at move in through enclosed spaces without making noise and not entirely succeeding. I killed my flashlight and stood in the dark of the documentation room. The footsteps moved, paused, moved again. I heard the stairwell hatch at the end of the main deck corridor open. Heard the footsteps start down toward a deck. Toward where I was standing in the dark with a binder full of classified research in my pack and my heart doing things it shouldn't have to do. I pressed myself into the corner behind the open door of the documentation room. The corridor outside went lighter as a flashlight beam swept through the porthole window. The footsteps stopped just outside. I could hear breathing now. Close enough to hear, and it wasn't the slow deep rhythm from below. This was human breathing. Tight and controlled and carry in the particular quality that comes from someone who is frightened but working very hard not to show it even to themselves. The flashlight beam moved on. Continued down the corridor toward the wet lab. I waited 30 seconds that felt like considerably more than 30 seconds, and then I stepped out of the documentation room and looked. A figure stood at the window of the wet lab, back to me. Flashlight beam pointed at the tanks inside. Their posture told me everything before I could see their face. Shoulders rigid, one hand flat against the wall beside the window for support. The specific stillness of someone seeing something they already knew was there and hadn't gotten any less terrible for the knowing. I said, "Hey," quietly, the way you say things on a ship where sound carries wrong and you've got something below you that responds to vibration. The figure spun around. A woman, middle-aged, dark-haired, wearing a vessel crew jacket with the Crestmore name patch on the chest. Her flashlight swung up to my face and I put my hand up and squinted, and she held it there for what felt like long enough to take inventory of everything about me before she lowered it. "You're not from the ship," she said. "No," I said. "Just found it." She exhaled, a long shuddering breath that she'd clearly been holding for longer than just the moment I startled her. She'd been holding it for a while, maybe days. "How did you get aboard?" she asked. "Accommodation ladder on the port bow." She nodded like this was information she was filling away. Her eyes kept moving though, keeping track of the corridor behind me and the stairwell ahead and the floor below our feet all at once. She'd been living on this ship long enough that watching all 3 directions simultaneously had become involuntary. "How long have you been here?" I asked. She looked at me. "Since before the world ended," she said. "So." She didn't finish the sentence. Her name was Dal. Eleanor Dahlstrom according to the name patch, but she said Dal before I could read it out loud. She'd been one of the 2 vessel crew assigned to the Crestmore for the Project Hadel deployment. Her job had been engine maintenance and mechanical systems, not science. She was explicit about that the way people are explicit about things when they need you to understand that what happened wasn't their fault. She hadn't known what was in the containment hold. Not really. They'd been told hazardous biological samples, deep sea origin, classified, don't ask questions that aren't related to your specific job function. And Dal was good at her job and not particularly curious about the science side, and she had kept her head down and done her work and not asked questions. Until she found Dr. Reyes. I didn't ask her to describe that. I could see from the way her jaw tightened when she referenced it that description wasn't something she was going to offer and wasn't something I needed. What happened to the rest of the crew? I asked. The researchers left first, she said. When the outbreak started reaching the coast, Dr. Voigt made the decision to evacuate the science team to a land facility. She said it was temporary. She said they'd be back in 72 hours and that Dal should stay aboard and maintain the ship systems and monitor the specimens. That was 30 days ago. And the specimens, I said. She looked at the floor. The ones in the tanks are fine, she said. The ones in the tanks I can manage. She paused. It's the one that isn't in a tank anymore that I have to be careful about. I thought about the photographs, the progression from small and translucent to something that wouldn't fit in a single frame anymore. I thought about the entry in the binder. We found Dr. Reyes. 3 words and a line of trailing ink. Where is it? I asked. She looked at the floor again, and this time it wasn't avoidance. She was looking at the floor the way you look at something when what you're afraid of is directly beneath where you're standing. "See deck," she said, "the containment hold. It went back down on its own 3 days after it got out. I don't know why. Maybe because the water is better down there. Maybe because it was." She stopped. "Maybe because it was what?" I asked. Her voice went quiet when she answered. "Maybe because it was waiting," she said, "for the right time." Dal had survived 30 days aboard the Crestmore through a combination of practical intelligence and what she described simply as being very careful. She'd maintained the ship systems because she needed power, needed the water circulation running for the tanks on a deck because the smaller specimens responded badly when the water quality degraded, and she'd learned early that degraded specimens in the tanks made the thing on sea deck agitated in ways that made the whole ship feel different. She'd learned to read the ship by now the way you learn to read a sick person's breathing. Certain sounds meant it was resting. Certain vibrations in the hull meant it was moving. And certain silences, specific, complete, wrong silences where even the mechanical background noise seemed to pull back. Those meant it was paying attention to something. She had a system, Dal did. She moved through the ship in patterns that she'd worked out over weeks of trial and observation. Never the same corridor twice in a row. Never the same time of day for the same task. Vary the routine, vary the sound, give it nothing to predict. She'd lasted 30 days doing this and she was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. The kind of tired that comes from 30 days of being the only person who knows a terrible thing and having absolutely nowhere to put that knowledge. She told me all of this in the documentation room while I showed her the binder. She didn't want to look at the photographs. But she looked at Dr. Voigt's final entries. She read them twice, the second time slower than the first, and when she looked up her expression had shifted from the controlled fear she'd been wearing since I found her to something rawer, more exposed. Voigt knew, Dal said. She knew what it was becoming and she left anyway. "She left you," I said. Dal set the binder down on the table. "There's something else you need to see," she said. She took me back to the wet lab. Not to look at the specimens in the tanks, though I could feel them tracking us through the glass in that way that made my skin want to be somewhere else. She took me to a workstation in the corner that I'd missed in my initial scan of the room because it was partially hidden behind a movable equipment rack. A monitoring terminal. Its screen dark but its indicator light still green, still powered. Dal typed in a sequence from memory and the screen came up. Live feeds, 6 camera angles covering sea deck. The containment hold was large, the full beam of the ship, bottom deck, with reinforced walls and a drainage system in the floor and heavy overhead rigging points for what I imagined had once been specimen tanks, large ones, industrial scale. Most of that infrastructure was destroyed, not from neglect, destroyed. The rigging points were bent, the wall bracketry was pulled from the steel. The floor showed deep gouges that ran in long arcs across the entire space. In the far corner of the feed, something large and very still. I leaned closer to the screen. It was hard to make out shape at that distance and in that light. But what I could see was this. It was bigger than the photographs had suggested even in their final frames. It occupied the corner of the containment hold the way a large animal occupies a space it has chosen deliberately, not trapped in it, settled in it. The dark pulsing core I'd seen in the smaller specimens was visible even at this resolution and this distance. A slow rhythmic pulse that matched exactly the sound I'd been hearin' through the floor since I came aboard. It wasn't moving. But as I watched the feed, the pulse changed. Just slightly, just barely enough to notice if you'd been watching the same rhythm for a while the way Dal had been watching it for 30 days. It went from the slow regular beat it had maintained while we were in the documentation room to something fractionally faster, more awake. Dal saw it too. She reached past me and killed the monitor. It knows we're both here now, she said. It could tell when you came aboard. I watched the pulse change. But two of us, that's different to it. Why? I asked. She looked at me steadily. Because one person it can afford to wait on, she said. One person it's been watching for 30 days and learning and not moving on yet for whatever reason it has. But two people means something is different. Two people means the situation changed. She paused. It doesn't like when the situation changes, she said. From somewhere far below us. So deep in the ship that it came up through the hull plating and the deck beams and the floor beneath our feet rather than through the air. The rhythm changed again. Dal had a rule about the sound changing. She'd developed it somewhere around day 8 when she'd still been trying to pretend that the thing in the containment hold was just an animal. Just a large unusual deep-sea organism that happened to have pulled itself free of its enclosure and happened to have gone back down to sea deck on its own and happened to be sitting in the corner down there doing nothing for days at a time. She'd told herself a lot of things in the first week that she'd stopped being able to tell herself after that. The rule was simple. When the pulse changes, you stop whatever you're doing, you move to a predetermined position, you make no sound and you make no pattern for at least 20 minutes. She grabbed my arm before I could say anything and pulled me out of the wet lab and into the corridor and then into a space I hadn't noticed before. A narrow equipment locker between the wet lab and the instrument room. Just wide enough for two people if neither of them was particularly broad. She pulled the locker door closed from inside using a length of paracord she'd rigged to the inside handle specifically for this purpose. We stood in the dark. I could feel Dal breathing next to me. Controlled, deliberate, the rhythm of someone who had practiced this specific kind of stillness until it became reflex. I matched it. The sound from below had changed again, not louder, not closer in any way I could physically locate, but different in its quality. The way a sound changes when the thing producing it is no longer at rest. The way an engine sounds different when it shifts from idle into gear. Still the same fundamental tone but with intention underneath it now, with direction. We stood in that locker for a long time. Long enough that my legs started complaining about it and I had to shift my weight slowly and carefully and Dal put her hand on my arm when I did it. Not harsh. Just a reminder. Not yet. Then I heard something I hadn't heard before from this ship. Movement. Actual physical movement in the structure of the vessel. Not the creak of metal contracting in cold air. Not the shift of the hull against the rocks at the bow. Movement that traveled through the ship's bones the way footsteps travel through a building's floors. Rhythmic, heavy, coming from below and moving upward. Dal's hand tightened on my arm. I didn't need the warning. The movement was slow. That was the thing that got into me worse than anything else about it. I'd spent 30 days being afraid of infected and the infected were fast, or some of them were, and speed at least made a certain kind of sense because speed was hunger and hunger was simple. But this was not fast. This was deliberate. This was the pace of something that had no reason to hurry because it already knew where it was going and had already decided that. Where it was going was where we were. I counted the decks by how the sound moved. C deck. B deck. The sound of something heavy moving through the lower stairwell access. A deck. The sound stopped. 40 seconds of complete silence that was somehow worse than the movement had been. Dal had stopped breathing entirely next to me. I could feel it in the absence of the small warm movement beside me. She was holding it the way you hold breath when you're a child and you've convinced yourself the thing under the bed can hear your exhale. Then a sound I'll describe as carefully as I can because I've been trying to find the right words for it since the moment I heard it. It was contact, something touching the corridor wall outside the equipment locker. Not a knock. Not a scrape. Contact the way you'd touch a wall if you were blind and navigating by feel. slow and exploratory and moving along the wall in the direction of the wet lab, past us, not finding us. Dal waited a full 2 minutes after the sound faded before she let out her breath. She put her mouth close to my ear and I could feel her voice more than hear it. It's in the wet lab, she whispered. It goes to check the tanks sometimes. Comes back up and checks the smaller ones. I don't know why. It just does. We have maybe 10 minutes before it finishes and goes back down. I whispered back. We need to get off this ship. I felt her nod in the dark. I know, she said. I've been trying to work out how for 22 days. She had a plan. Partly. She explained it in the dark of the equipment locker in a voice so quiet I had to reconstruct some of it from context and lip-reading in near zero visibility. The Crestmore had a rigid inflatable rescue boat mounted on the starboard deck aft of the superstructure. A proper offshore RIB, the kind research vessels carry for crew safety. It had fuel in its tanks because Dal had checked it and maintained it because maintaining things was how she stayed sane and because somewhere around day 12 she'd accepted that eventually she was going to need to use it. The problem was the mount. The RIB was stored on a hydraulic launch cradle that lowered it over the side and into the water. The cradle ran on ship's power and it worked fine. Dal had tested it. But the cradle's controls were on the exterior deck, and to reach the exterior deck from our current position on a deck we had to go back up through the main stairwell and through the main deck corridor and out the superstructure hatch. Which meant passin' the wet lab, where the thing currently was. And we'd have to do it without triggering whatever sensory system it used to track movement, because on an open deck, it would have nothing to muffle our footsteps and nothing to muffle the hydraulic sound of the launch cradle deploying and nothing to muffle the outboard motor of the RIB startling to life. And the question of how much of a head start we'd have between making that sound and it reaching the main deck was a question neither of us could answer with any confidence. I asked Dal what it did when it reached the main deck. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know, she said. It's never been that far up before. When it comes up it stops at a deck and then goes back down. But that was when it was just me. That was when the situation wasn't different. Right, I said. She didn't need to explain what different meant. I thought about the documentation room, the photographs, the specimen that had grown beyond the camera frame, the entry about strategic patience, about waitin' for the stimulus to approach, about protocognition developin' into something the researcher had stopped being able to categorize as proto-dash. It had been on this ship for 30 days since the outbreak. It had watched Dal for 30 days, learned her patterns, tested the boundaries of its range, understood the ship the way something understands an environment it has had exclusive access to for long enough. And it had not moved on her. Not yet. Which meant it was still in a phase where it was calculating something, still measuring something against some internal threshold that we didn't have the research framework to predict. And the question that sat in the back of my brain while we crouched in that equipment locker was what changes when the threshold tips? What does it do when it decides it's done observin'? I didn't ask Dal that question out loud because I was fairly certain she'd been living with it every day for 3 weeks and didn't need me to put words to it. We have to go now, I said. While it's occupied. She said nothing for 2 seconds. Then she unwound the paracord from the door handle and opened the locker. The corridor was empty and the wet lab porthole showed light movin' within the room. Our light, still on from when Dal had killed the monitor. And something else movin' in that light that I kept my eyes away from deliberately because looking at it through that window was not something I had room for right now in terms of keeping my feet movin'. We went to the stairwell. Slowly, each footfall placed with the specific care of people who have been reminded very recently of what sound costs in this environment. Dal led because she knew the ship and I followed because this was not the moment to have opinions about order. Main deck. We came up through the stairwell hatch and into the main corridor, and the air was warmer up here, and the fog outside the portholes had thinned to something gauzy and pale in the early afternoon light. The superstructure hatch at the far end of the corridor was 40 feet away. We moved. Halfway down the corridor, a sound from below. Not the slow exploratory contact from before, a sharp sound, a single impact, like something heavy making contact with a wall at force. Then silence. Then a low sound that moved through the ship's structure the same way the earlier movement had but faster this time. The unhurried deliberateness was gone. It had found the locker. It had found where we'd been standin'. Dal grabbed my sleeve and we stopped moving carefully and just moved, the remaining 20 feet to the superstructure hatch covered in the kind of time that erases any pretense of stealth and replaces it with a simple animal calculation of speed versus distance. I hit the hatch first and shoved it open, and the cold salt air hit me like a correction, like the outside world reasserting itself. The deck. We ran starboard and aft. The fog gave us maybe 40 feet of visibility, and the launch cradle was within that range. The RIB sat on it like a promise. Orange hull, outboard motor tilted up, fuel lines connected, real and solid and possible. Dal hit the control panel on the cradle housing, and the hydraulic system came alive with a sound that was catastrophically loud after the enforced silence of the last 20 minutes. A mechanical groan and hiss as the cradle arms extended and the rib began to lower over the side. It moved with the speed of industrial hydraulics, which is to say not very fast and not very quiet, and the seconds it took stretched in that particular way that seconds stretch when you're standing on an open deck listening for something to come through a hatch behind you. 40 seconds. 50. The cradle reached the waterline and the RIB settled into the dark water of the inlet with a soft impact that felt almost gentle given the context. Dal was already moving to the boarding ladder on the rail. I went to follow her, and the superstructure hatch opened. I didn't look directly. I made a decision in approximately 0 seconds that looking directly was not something I was going to do, and that decision has meant that what I can tell you about what came through that hatch is limited to peripheral impression and the evidence of what it did to the deck behind me as I went over the rail. Large. I knew that from the photographs. Wrong in its proportions in the specific way the photographs had suggested, but worse for being real and moving rather than frozen in a printed image. And fast. The thing about the strategic patience and the deliberate movement in the corridor below was that those were choices. I understood that in the half-second between hearing the hatch and going over the rail, the slowness was chosen. The speed underneath it was what it actually was. It crossed the deck behind me in a time that shouldn't have been possible for something that size. I hit the boarding ladder and went down it in the way you go down a ladder when something is behind you, which is to say not carefully and not slowly, and the bottom of it dunked me in 2 feet of black water that was cold enough to stop my breath completely for a moment before I got my feet under me and threw myself into the RIB. Dal had the motor down and the cord pulled before I was fully in the boat. It started. First pull, Dal's 30 days of maintenance. The outboard caught and roared in the quiet of the inlet, and she had it in gear, and we were moving away from the hull before I'd gotten myself upright. I looked back then, because I needed to know. The thing was at the rail above us. It had stopped at the rail, looking down at the water between the ship and the RIB with the specific quality of consideration that Dal had described as strategic patience and that I now understood differently than I had when she first used those words. It wasn't afraid of the water. It had come from water 6,000 meters deep, and this coastal inlet was nothing to it. It was calculating. The same thing it had been doing for 30 days. Measuring something against a threshold we couldn't define. I held its gaze for exactly as long as it took Dal to open the throttle fully, and then the distance between us and the Crestmore began to grow in a way that felt inadequate and necessary simultaneously. We cleared the mouth of the inlet and hit open water, and the fog swallowed the ship behind us until there was nothing left of it but the amber glow of its lights behind the gray. And then even that was gone. Dal didn't speak for a long time. She kept her eyes forward and her hand on the throttle and her jaw set in the expression of someone who has been waiting for permission to fall apart and has decided the permission hasn't come yet. I watched the fog close in behind us. In and out. The rhythm of it was still in my chest, the pulse of that dark core in the photographs. The slow patient beat of something that had been awake and waiting long before the outbreak gave it a context that anyone would understand. I thought about what Dr. Voigt had written in her final coherent entry. Behavioral inhibition fails under prolonged exposure. I thought about what Dal had said. It doesn't like when the situation changes. I thought about it standing at that rail above us. Calculatin'. And I wondered if we'd left because we escaped. Or because it had finished what it needed to observe and decided to let us go this time for reasons that had nothing to do with our choices and everything to do with its own. I didn't say that to Dal. She was driving the boat, and she needed to be driving the boat, and some thoughts you keep behind your teeth for the sake of the person next to you who is also barely holding together. I kept it behind my teeth. And watched the fog. We ran north along the coast for 2 hours before Dal eased back on the throttle. Not because she wanted to stop, Not because either of us felt far enough from the Crestmore to feel anything adjacent to safe, but because the fuel gauge had been dropping steadily since we cleared the inlet, and running the outboard at full throttle in cold water burns more than the theoretical range suggests, and Dal knew this because maintaining engines and calculating margins was the language she thought in, and right now that language was the only thing keeping her functional. 20% left, she said. We need to find a beach. The fog had thinned as we moved north. Coastline visible now to the east. Rocky in places, sandy in stretches, the dark line of the tree line behind it running unbroken for miles. No structures visible, no lights, no signs of the kind of organized human presence that the before world would have left behind in a stretch of coast this close to populated areas. The after world had a different relationship with coastlines. People moved inland when things got bad, toward food sources, toward shelter, toward other people. The coast felt exposed. Too much open water behind you and too much open ground between you and anything useful. That calculation had cleared the shoreline in the early weeks and kept it clear, and that suited me fine right now because what I needed was empty and dark and quiet, and a beach that nobody was watching. Dal found one about 20 minutes later. A gravel bar that jutted into a small protected cove where a creek emptied into the ocean, and the tree line came down close to the water's edge. She brought the RIB in slow, and we dragged it above the tiddleline and sat on the gravel, and neither of us said anything for a while. The sea behind us was gray and still. No sound from it except the small patient sound of waves on gravel. Nothing followed us. Or nothing we could see had followed us. I kept that distinction between those two things and left it there, and turned my attention to what we had, and what we needed, and what came next, because the alternative was sittin' on a gravel beach thinking about what was in that containment hold, and what it had been measuring when it stood at the rail and watched us go, and I wasn't ready to sit with that yet. We had food from the galley. I'd packed what I could carry before things went sideways, and Dal had a dry bag she'd kept staged near the superstructure hatch for exactly this eventuality. Water from the ship's tanks in 2 bottles each. The Project Hadel binder in my pack. Dal's 30 days of handwritten notes that she'd been keeping in a waterproof case clipped to the inside of her jacket like it was the most important thing she owned, which it probably was. And a radio. Dal pulled it from her dry bag while I was still taking inventory. A maritime handheld, the kind research vessels carry for crew communication. Waterproof, battery-powered. The batteries replaced by Dal 2 weeks ago because maintaining things was how she stayed sane, and she'd thought about the radio specifically as part of the eventual leaving plan she'd been slowly constructing. Does it reach anything from here? I asked. She powered it on. Checked the battery indicator. 3 bars. Maritime Channel 16, she said. The international distress frequency. If anyone is still monitoring it out here. She paused. If anyone has equipment that's still workin'. She didn't finish the sentence because the end of it was obvious and neither of us needed it said out loud. Try, I said. She held the radio for a moment without keying it. Looking at it the way you look at something when you need to decide whether the hope it represents is worth the cost of it not working. She keyed it. This is Eleanor Dahlstrom, vessel crew RV Crestmore, she said. Her voice was steady in a way that told me it was costing her something to make it steady. Broadcasting on Channel 16. We are ashore on the Washington coast, coordinates unknown, 2 survivors. We have documentation from a classified research project with direct relevance to the outbreak. We need contact with any survivor network or emergency response capability still operating in the region. Please respond. She released the key. Static. We sat with the static for a while. The creek behind us ran over rocks with a sound that was almost peaceful, and the trees moved in a light coastal wind, and the ocean stayed flat and gray, and gave nothing back. Then, faint, broken by interference, comin' in and out the way distant transmissions do when terrain and atmosphere are workin' against you. Receiving you. Come again on your position. Dal looked at me. I nodded. She keyed the radio again and repeated the transmission with more detail this time. What we'd found, what the ship was, what the Project Hadel documentation contained in terms that were specific enough to be credible and vague enough not to sound like the ramblings of 30-day survivors who'd come apart at the edges. The response came back stronger this time. Whoever was on the other end had adjusted something on their side. The voice was a man's voice, middle-aged, with the particular cadence of someone who had been operating a radio communication post for long enough that the formality of it had become second nature even after the world stopped running the way it used to. Understood Crestmore crew, We are a survivor coordination network operating out of the Olympic Peninsula. We have a forward position approximately 40 kilometers north of your estimated location. Can you hold your position until we can get a boat to you?" Dal looked at the tree line and then at the water and then at me. "How long?" she asked. 6 hours, maybe 8. I thought about the fuel in the RIB, thought about the distance between this beach and the inlet where the Crestmore sat run aground on its rocks with its lights still on, and something in its containment hold that had been standin' at the rail above us calculatin' something we couldn't define. 6 hours on an open beach was a long time. But it was a number. It was a concrete thing with an edge on it, and a shape we could plan around, and after 30 days of no numbers and no plans and no shapes that held together when you pressed on them. A concrete thing was something you held onto with both hands. "We'll hold," Dal said into the radio. I used the first hour to write. Not in my own hand because my handwriting has always been poor and under field conditions it gets worse. But Dal had a pencil in her dry bag and a spare notebook and she wrote as I talked. A summary of everything in the Project Hadel binder, everything on the documentation room walls, everything the security footage on the monitoring terminal had shown before Dal killed the screen. And Dal's own account, 30 days of it, the species' behavioral progression she'd observed, the patterns she'd mapped, the things she'd learned about how it moved through the ship and what made the pulse change and what the silence meant when the silence went wrong. It took more than an hour. Her hand was cramping by the end, and mine would have been too. But when we were done we had 2 copies of everything. One in the binder that was already in my pack and one in Dal's notebook that went back into her dry bag in the waterproof case. 2 copies because if something happened to one of us between this beach and wherever that coordination network was operating from, the information still existed. That was the thing about information in the afterworld. It was the most fragile thing there was and the most important simultaneously. Food and water and shelter kept your body going. But information was the difference between the people who survived making the same catastrophic mistakes over and over because they didn't know why things fell apart the first time, and the people who survived with something to build on. Project Hadel was exactly the kind of thing that needed to not disappear into another locked room on another runaground ship in a foggy inlet where nobody would think to look. I thought about what the binder's early pages had described, the material recovered from 6,000 meters depth. Persistent, the first researcher had written, persistent. And I thought about the outbreak, about what the emergency broadcasts had said in the first 72 hours before the broadcasts started failing one by one. Containment of a novel pathogen, origin under investigation. Do not approach individuals displaying behavioral changes. Behavioral changes. The same language Dr. Voigt had used in the Project Hadel documentation. Not the same outbreak. I wasn't ready to make that claim and I didn't have the science background to support it even if I had been. But connected. The thing in the Crestmore's containment hold had come from somewhere deep and old and patient, and it had been brought up and studied and pushed and altered for 18 months before the world ended. And whether that had anything to do with why the world ended, or whether they were 2 separate catastrophes occupying the same historical moment was a question that needed people smarter than me working on it with access to the full documentation. Which was why the documentation couldn't disappear. Dal sat beside me on the gravel bar and looked at the ocean. "Do you think it'll come off the ship?" she asked. "Eventually," I said. Because I thought lying to her was an insult she didn't deserve after 30 days on that vessel. She nodded slowly. "It went back down on its own," she said, "after Dr. Reyes. It could have stayed topside. It could have gone over the rail any time it wanted to. But it went back down to sea deck and it stayed there and it watched and it learned and it waited." She picked up a piece of gravel and turned it in her fingers. "That's what scares me more than anything else about it," she said. "Not what it did. What it didn't do when it could have." I thought about that. The infected above ground didn't make those calculations. They were hunger and reaction and forward motion without strategy. The Crestmore's inhabitant was something categorically different from what was wandering the forests and the highway corridors and the collapsed city streets up above. It was different in a way that the outbreak, as terrible as it was, hadn't fully prepared anyone to think about. The outbreak was a crisis. What was in that containment hold was a variable. And variables in a broken system were the thing that determined whether you rebuilt something or whether the rebuilding never got traction because the ground kept shifting under it. The coordination network's boat arrived in the 7th hour. A converted sport fishing vessel with a small crew of 4 who came in cautious and hailed us from 50 meters offshore before approaching, and who relaxed only incrementally when they confirmed we were who the radio transmission had described. They were young, most of them, mid-20s, with the particular combination of competence and exhaustion that the afterworld was producing in the people who kept themselves together long enough to organize into something. Their leader was a woman named Huang who asked clear questions and listened to complete answers and didn't interrupt, and when Dal and I had finished the summary version of what we'd found, she sat with it for a moment in the way that serious people sit with serious information before they respond. Then she asked to see the binder. I gave it to her. She read Dr. Voigt's final entries twice, the same way Dal had in the documentation room, and her expression did the same thing Dal's had done. Moved from professional composure into something rawer and more exposed for just a moment before she brought it back under control. This needs to go to the network's research team, she said. We have 3 people with biology backgrounds, not specialists but enough to work through this documentation and understand what it means. She looked up from the binder. And the ship, she said. We need to know where it is. Dal gave her the coordinates from memory. She'd memorized them the way she'd memorized the cradle control sequence and the battery replacement schedule and everything else she'd needed to keep in her head for 30 days because the act of maintaining those details had been the act of maintaining herself. Huang noted them and got on her own radio and spoke in terse shorthand to whoever was on the other end of her network. Then she looked back at us. The ship stays quarantined for now, she said. We don't have the capability to address what you're describing and we're not going to pretend we do. We mark it, we track it, and we make sure nobody else stumbles onto it the way you did. That was the right call and I said so. We boarded the fishing vessel, and the crew pushed off from the gravel bar, and turned north, and the Crestmore's inlet fell away behind us behind its curtain of coastline and fog. I stood at the stern and watched the shoreline. The sun was going down behind the overcast, that bruised yellow light that I'd been waking up to for 30 days, painting the water in shades that had stopped looking natural around the same time everything else had. Dal stood beside me. She had her waterproof case in both hands, her 30 days of notes against her chest like something she wasn't ready to put down yet. Barrett Voigt had all that data, she said quietly, using the project director's name the way you use names when you're finally far enough from something to be angry at it instead of just afraid of it. All that documentation, all that observation time, and she still didn't understand what she was dealing with. No, I agreed. Dal looked at the water. Do you think anyone ever will? She asked. I thought about persistent, the word circled in pencil by a later hand with what felt like accusation. I thought about 6,000 meters of dark water and how long something had to be down there to become what we'd seen in those photographs. How long it had to be down there before being brought up by a sediment core sample and placed in a tank and studied by people who believed they understood the shape of what they were looking at. I think someone has to try, I said. Dal was quiet for a while. The coast moved past us in the fading light. The same trees, the same rocks, the same fog sitting on the water's surface with its patient shapeless weight. Then she said, it was looking at us when we left, wasn't it, at the rail? It was looking at us and it wasn't afraid and it wasn't angry. Yeah, I said. She nodded like she'd known the answer before she asked it. What was it doing then? She said. I thought about the photographs again, the progression of images pinned in chronological order on a documentation room wall, small and translucent to something that wouldn't fit in a frame. I thought about behavioral inhibition fails under prolonged exposure and strategic patience, and what the researcher had written about its relationship to stimuli. About waiting for the stimulus to approach rather than approaching the stimulus. I thought about the 30 days it had spent on that ship with Dal, learning the patterns, testing the limits of its range, observing, calling, not moving until the situation changed. Remembering. I think it was filling something in, I said, some piece of information it needed. Dal looked at me. About us, she said. About us, I said. She turned back to the water and didn't say anything else for a long time. Neither did I. The boat moved north, and the light continued to fail, and somewhere behind us in a rocky inlet on the Washington coast a ship sat with its amber lights on, and its tanks running, and its lower decks quiet. Patiently quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't absence. The kind that's waitin'. The kind that has been waitin' for longer than any of us has the context to understand. in water deeper than light reaches and older than any of the categories we built for thinkings about what lives in the world alongside us. And as the coastline darkened and the first stars appeared through breaks in the overcast, and the network's fishing vessel ran north through water that looked like hammered iron in the fading light, I stood at the stern and felt the specific weight of knowin' something that can't be unknowed. And I watched the ocean. And I did not look away.